My name is Stewart Lawton. I'm a member of the Never Again group, which is based here in Hamilton, Ontario, and which is presenting this evening. Never Again defends Israel from baseless accusations and media bias, to which we respond principally with letter writing. We have been published extensively across local and national media for many years. We are immensely grateful to Addis Israel, their support, and to be here in this wonderful synagogue. Rabbi Weiser was instrumental in facilitating this event. Now, Israeli issues are often in conflict with Islamic issues, and vice versa. So we are presenting this forum for two authors and their recent relevant books. They are Christine Douglas Williams, author of The Challenge of Modernizing Islam, and Howard Rotberg, author of The Ideological Path to Submission. These authors and their works have already generated intense discussion. But there are other significant figures with us. Raheel Raza will introduce Christine Douglas Williams, and Salim Mansoor will introduce Howard Rotberg. These are all brave people. We live today in an era of rigid ideological conformity. And if you question this conformity, your good intentions are not assumed. Raheel and Salim are Muslim Canadians, doubly courageous because many of their faith reject them for separating religion and politics. Our event is being recorded by Tahir Gora, president of Tag TV, which has YouTube and Facebook channels and a media outlet with worldwide reach. tagtv.info is their website, and you'll be able to see, anyone in the world will be able to see tonight's events soon. Tahir Gora is publisher and a writer, founder of Canadian Thinkers Forum, the Progressive Muslims Institute of Canada, and the Muslim Committee Against Anti-Semitism. Salim Mansoor was born in India and teaches at the University of Western Ontario. He is a nationally syndicated columnist for Sun Media and has been published in the Globe and Mail, National Post, and U.S. journals on foreign policy and developments in the Middle East and South Asia. He is a distinguished senior fellow with the Gatestone Institute in New York, a member of the board of directors for the Center of Islamic Pluralism, based in Washington, D.C., and a founding member of Toronto-based Council of Muslims Facing Tomorrow. Salim believes Canada is losing out because it, quote, drank the Kool-Aid of multiculturalism, which has profoundly weakened Canada's ability to get new immigrants to adopt Canadian values. He accuses our politicians of being abject and craven when dealing with the Muslim world. And he insists that multiculturalism empowers immigrants from non-Western societies to demand their host country adapt to the cultural requirements of immigrants instead of the other way around. You might be wondering what his views are on some hot-button issues, such as the ongoing situation with Israel and Hamas in Gaza. He writes, "What we are witnessing is Israel engaged in a struggle against Hamas and against an expanding body of opinion in the West that is less and less inhibited from displaying the rancid anti-Semitism behind its support for those, support for those such as Hamas, who openly call for another Holocaust for the Jews." He continues, "Critics of Israel's military action against Hamas have erased from their memory what the government of Israel in 2005, then led by Ariel Sharon, unilaterally did in withdrawing from Gaza and handing it over to representatives of the Palestinian people. Jewish settlers in Gaza who had insisted on remaining were removed by force because there was no guarantee they would be allowed to survive." And there's this from another article. Quote, "The Quran was turned by a significant number of Muslims into a weapon by which to kill, and ironically, to prevent a culture of enlightenment. What the world finds among Arabs and Muslims is a culture of envy, of denial, of resentment, of bigotry that keeps bubbling into warfare. Salim Mansoor believes it is only possible to find Islam as a faith and not a political religion in a free society. Let's welcome him now to introduce Howard Raj Burke.
Greenish Natural Health brings to you an extensive line of vitamins and supplements which are halal, kosher, and veggie certified, as well as gluten-free, dairy-free, soy-free, and non-GMO that can serve the needs of the whole family. In short, totally suitable to the needs of any cultural, religious, or dietary requirements. Ask for Greenish products at your nearest pharmacy.
Stewart indicated that I should introduce you to my friend, and what could be more delightful than talking about my friend? And what I want to share with you is how I got to become his friend, or he become my brother. A few years ago, when I had my manuscript going around looking for a publisher, parts of it had already been published to some sort of critical discussion in various outputs. People had told me to put it together and get it published as a book. And so I did, and I was looking for a publisher. I found an agency at a reference of a friend, Ann Porter. Some of you would know her. She was a key Porter Books, and she introduced me to Linda Knight. And Linda took my manuscript and sent it to many publishing houses across Canada. And after a few months, it was a pile of pink slips that she sent me. No one was interested in publishing my critique of multiculturalism. Well, I thought, I stepped on a minefield. I had gored the sacred cow of Canadian identity. And who am I to do that? So I despaired, and I thought I wouldn't get my book published. But then one day Linda wrote me a note, said, I think there is this guy up there in Brantford, and he runs a publishing house called Mantua Books. So if you permit me, I'll send your manuscript to Mantua Books. I said, why not? Long time ago, way back when I was barely a teenager, I had read somewhere in a book that beggars can't be choosers. I was from Calcutta, which is a city full of beggars. So I said, yeah, do go ahead, send it to Mantua. Let's see what happened. And I got a reply very soon from this guy in Brantford saying, Dr. Mansoor, I'm interested in your stuff. I'll have a contract ready. Will you sign it? And if you're interested, come over and we'll have you sign the contract. So I got into my car, hadn't ever come to Brantford. All I negotiated was 403 between Toronto and London, where I had moved on to, and I didn't know where I was headed. But I came to Brantford, spent an afternoon with this guy, a lawyer, a published author, a president of Mantua Books, and it was a delightful lunch. He paid the bill. He published my book. Today we are friends, brothers, and good folks together. And that is my friend Howard Raj Burke, the only who manages and runs the only publishing house in Canada that publishes conservative writers. So there is a place in Canada where conservatives can get published. There's a place in Canada where there is no sacred cows, and there's a place where beggars don't have to be choosers. So I took off. The book got published. It went into a second edition. Howard sent the book to the United States. It won the Eric Hoffer Most Provocative Book of the Year award in 2014, the Montaigne Medal, and all because of this publishing house that mainstream Canadians do not look up to or do not count. But you know, as they say, coal can be found everywhere, but it is the diamond, which is basically the same ingredient, right? That carbon dioxide is a rare product. So the mainstream publishing houses are full, and they're also dying. Key Porter died, Stoddard died, all publishing houses are dying, but the diamond is growing, and that's because of Howard's dedication to the values that he represents and Mantua books represent. So my good friend, Howard Rothbeck.
I'm just going to define the terms ideology and submission, and then I'm going to explain why I became such a student of ideologies, cultural values, the things that you don't always read about because people don't ever want to admit that they have an ideology. It's always the guy they don't like has an ideology. And if you write about their ideology, it exposes them. And then they get mad at me. Oh well. Under one of the dictionaries says, ideology is a systematic body of concepts, especially about human life or culture, a manner or the content of thinking characteristic of an individual, group, or culture, the integrated assertions, theories, and aims that constitute a socio-political program. And ideology in its most powerful form is hidden from the view of those people who submit to it. Once it can be clearly perceived, it effectively loses its power of social control. Conversely, to believe oneself to be non-ideological is actually equivalent to being driven primarily by ideology. Submission is the action or fact of accepting or yielding to a superior force or to the will or authority of another person or to the divine. I grew up in Brantford. I don't live there anymore. I live in Hamilton now. And for some reason, I grew up, born in '51, so I was a teenager in the turbulent times of the counterculture, the hippies, all kinds of anti-American stuff that came out from young American mouths and young Canadian mouths. And, you know, I listened to music. In 1969, I was 18, and some music came on the air. It went like this: war, huh? Yeah. What is it good for? Absolutely nothing. War, huh? Yeah. What is it good for? Absolutely nothing. That was Edwin Starr. He was a Motown artist. He made millions from that because everyone was opposed to the Vietnam War, which of course was problematic, and whether it was worthwhile. I mean, it was supposed to stop communism, but never did. So people were anti-war when I was growing up. But even in the early 60s, before Vietnam, the protest music I listened to a Jewish guy from Minnesota who at 21 years old became a major star, and he changed his name from Zimmerman to Bob Dylan. And I don't know if you might have heard a song called Blowin' in the Wind. Huge, huge. How many roads must a man walk down? I'm not going to say the whole thing, just before you call him a man. How many seas must a white dove sail before she sleeps in the sand? Yes, and how many times must the cannonballs fly before they're forever banned? The answer, my friend, is blowing in the wind, whatever that means. Dylan has, in interviews, has explained what but I'll leave that aside. The part that bothered me is that, you know, the cannonballs had to be banned. So I was really on the outside. Why? My mother was born in Brantford of a Jewish family that left small shtetl near Kiev in Ukraine. But my father was a survivor of Auschwitz. So he lost his parents there. He lost his then 8-year-old sister in 1943 in the gas chambers of Auschwitz. He was slave labor, and fortunately he and 2 brothers survived. Another half-brother made his way to what was then called Palestine, and they found each other in the late 50s. Anyway, so you can imagine that when everybody's saying war is bad, and I'm reading Mahatma Gandhi and the Dalai Lama, these are people that I find this totally absurd when I'm reading this stuff. Because if war is bad, and there was no war, if the British, the Canadians, the Americans hadn't entered in as allies against the Nazis, I wouldn't be here. So we didn't have to be awfully bright to figure that out. If they would have said, sorry, the Nazis are kind of bad, but it's a different culture, and we have to respect their culture. Well, this became a problem for me. I went to University of Toronto. I've lately returned both my degrees to University of Toronto. I have a degree in law as well as in history, and I returned it as a protest for them being the first university to hold a noxious event called Israel Apartheid Week. And I tried to explain to the president, who was a medical doctor and was, I'm sure, a nice man, but he understands nothing. And I said, "This is would you allow a program here that says that all professors are fascists? No. So you have something just as absurd to say Israel is apartheid." And it's not got to do with diversity of opinion or free speech. It's got to do with standards. You're a university. You cannot promote ridiculous, hateful, anti-Semitic notions. So I gave back my degrees. So I no longer have degrees. So what happened to this Bob Dylan fella? I just want to, hopefully some of you will read the book. It's in a sequel to my previous book called Tolerism. Tolerism, I decided, was an ideology of excessive tolerance, where people were so tolerant of people who themselves were illiberal and intolerant that if those other people took over, they would end all tolerance. That's the Popper paradox, named after Karl Popper, the British Austrian philosopher who was anti-violence and anti-war until the Second World War, and then he realized that there's a problem with tolerance. So I took a look and decided that this description of tolerance or toleration had morphed into a major ideology. And this ideology is that tolerance was the important thing when I, a student of history and law, and a Jew who reads the Torah, thought liberty and justice are the main goals, not tolerance. So I started feeling out of sync with majority culture. Fortunately, by 1983, that fellow Dylan who wrote Blowin' in the Wind when he was 21 had gone through all kinds of changes, including being a Christian for a while, and then Lubavitcher got hold of him, and then he wrote an absolutely brilliant album in 1983 called Infidels. Not too many people know about it, but there's not too many people besides myself who are interested in Bob Dylan and Kabbalah. But the lyrics in the album are heavily derived from Kabbalah. And I'm just going to read you a couple lyrics that showed me that the man finally clued in. This is called License to Kill. Now they take him and they teach him and they groom him for life and they set him on a path where he's bound to get ill. Then they bury him with stars, sell his body like they do used cars. Now there's a woman on my block, she just sit there facing the hill. She say, who gonna take away his license to kill? Now he's hell-bent for destruction, he's afraid and confused, and his brain has been mismanaged with great skill. All he believe are his eyes, and his eyes, they just tell him lies. But there's a woman on my block sitting there in a cold chill. She say, who gonna take away his license to kill? Now he worships at an altar of a stagnant pool, and when he sees his reflection, he's fulfilled. Oh, man is opposed to fair play. He wants it, and he wants it his way. I think Dylan clued in 1983 to the killing. Excuse me, I'm just going to talk about, well, since I'm talking about music and culture, my endeavor is really to study the history of culture and values. What we've tried, the left has tried to do, and they were in large part enabled by Jews who were in the Frankfurt School in philosophy in Europe and came to New York and influenced countless university professors towards evil. Postmodernism, cultural relativism, moral moral equivalency, all these things that I write about and speak out about, and have created a publishing house to try to overcome this cultural relativism. It's very, very dreadful. Salim will tell you that not all cultures are equal. But if you go to a school or any kind of public event, or you listen to the Prime Minister of Canada, all cultures are equal. And in fact, the best thing we can do, according to our young nitwit Prime Minister who never finished university, the best thing we can do is have inclusive diversity. Inclusive diversity. So here I am, and I say, okay, so if the Nazis were around, we have to bring the Nazis in for some inclusive diversity. So I don't get it, but I'm on the outs, because National Post won't even publish me when I try and suggest something like that. I'm countercultural, but I don't have a lot of hippies backing me up, but I do have some wonderful people who are working in the same direction that I'm working. After Auschwitz, multiculturalism and moral relativism are obscene. Ladies and gentlemen, we are in a war now. Not next year or the year after, but we've been in a war since 9/11. 9/11 was the opening blow by the Islamists, financed by Saudi Arabia, who's supposed to be a great friend of the United States. There's Saudi Arabia that does not allow Jews to work there, does not allow any freedoms, is behind the Wahhabist terror, is not a proper love match for the United States of America. Love requires reciprocity. The United States relationship with the evil princes of Saudi Arabia is unrequited love. We have some hope, those of us who follow the Israel situation and the growing power of Iran allied with Shiite terror groups like Hezbollah, Hamas, the terrible situation in Yemen, where Iran is really messed up big time in Yemen. Those of us who follow this, and we know that maybe Saudi Arabia is going to inch towards Israel. And I'm not here to talk about that, but there's all kinds of things that might happen. But whatever happens, we have to ground ourselves in a clear understanding of ideologies. The ideologies discussed in my book trace the path of certain ways of thinking that paved the way for a submission by the free world to an ideology called Islamism, which is based on Islam and has captured a large part of the leadership of the religion of Islam. To the extent that the West refuses to drive a wedge between ordinary Muslim immigrants to the West and the Islamist political and religious and terrorist leaders is the extent to which we fall into submission. The worst thing I see on a daily basis is our government, our political leaders, mistaking the bad guys for the good guys. These are the good guys, and they are dealing with Islamists who have, first thing they did, you understand about the Muslim Brotherhood, there's no actual organization called the Muslim Brotherhood, but they actually control everything. And look, Hillary Clinton's best friend and chief advisor was a major figure in the Muslim Brotherhood. Major, Huma Abedin, okay? Can you imagine if John Kennedy would have made a communist his chief advisor? What would have gone on? The American media said, so what? You know, that's inclusive. It's inclusive diversity. No, it's treason. The people who say they're so tolerant, the tolerants, don't really believe in tolerance. They use it as not a starting point for debate, but a way to close off debate. I've had more than one person start to talk to me about why tolerance is so wonderful, and when I start to tell them why liberty and justice are more important, they'll turn around and walk away. So they don't even tolerate me, but they want to tolerate every bad guy on the face of the earth, which tells me that they view me as much worse than they do Osama bin Laden. So we have a real problem in our education system. We have so many problems I don't even know where to start, but I'll just hit a few of them. By the way, when I'm getting close, I can go on for 4 or 5 hours, no problem, but we can't do it that way. So when I'm 5 minutes from when I'm supposed to stop, just let me know and I'll go to my conclusion. Okay. I wanted to talk about education a little bit. The education system is the clearest case of our submission to Islamism that I can think of. In the Maritimes, there were some 19 and 20-year-old Syrian refugees that were sent to high school to learn English, and of course started bullying and beating up the kids. And the way the school solved the problem was to give them a prayer room. There's a Roman Catholic high school in London, Ontario, and it's a Roman Catholic school. It's a religious school. You know, it's odd that is a historical accident that they got funding and not other religious schools, but I can live with it. The Muslim students were going there and they said, we don't feel that we're included. So they now have a Muslim prayer room in a Roman Catholic school. There's a great writer here, Christine Williams. She's superb. She wrote about a very sad case about Peel. There, not only they have a prayer room, but they have sermons. And I think some of the sermons are in English, some are in Arabic. But this is a public school where, you know, Christmas time, you can't really talk about Jesus, you have to talk about Santa Claus. And there's no religion that's allowed in except for the religion to which we are submitting. And that is not really a religion we're submitting to. We're submitting to a certain concept of politicizing it and picking up the most violent aspects of it and not allowing it to transition into something that can coexist with us in the West, who have liberal values, who treat women and children properly. Anyway, the story that I read by Christine Williams said the students were upset because somebody was going to take this privilege away from them, and they said, well, not only so they said, fine, you can have that, but you have to submit the sermons to us so we can review what's being taught. No. And the Peel Board allowed that. So you can, if you live in Brampton or wherever this is and your kids go to school, then there's other Muslim children who are learning something that we don't even have the right to know what they're being taught. We are submitting to the ideology of Islamism, And when we're in a war, the war is with Islamism. The war is not with every Muslim. It is with Islamism, a violent ideology that rejects the separation of church and state. We know what it is. So if we have a war, we have to fight back. And in the idea of Mr. Trudeau for inclusive diversity, his idea is that we should welcome anyone with any ideology. And those of us who study this know that the Islamists are very clever in the way they've been able to establish their organizations front and center. That the government of Canada provides funding to their organizations, not to the organizations that we think are the ones that should be occupying our fair country. Not occupying is a tainted term. Living with us in our, we do occupy native lands, I must. A couple of minutes, thank you. Okay. So I probably made about 1/10 of what I prepared to talk about, but fortunately you can read the book. I'm just going to give you my conclusion. There may not have been enough facts to support the conclusion, but you get, I think, the thrust of what I'm saying. The motion 103 with the, again, it's about submission because they only Islamophobia. And what is Islamophobia? Did you ever ask anybody to define that and get a satisfactory answer? It's if there's a phobia, it's an irrational fear. But let's say it's rational fear and you change the word phobia. It's a sword to beat us with. It's not a shield against our racism. Okay, anyway, the term should be Islamist phobia. I'm not going to talk about the ideologies, but there are things like denialism. Denial is basically denying reality, and it doesn't last for long. Eventually, reality wins out, and people who have this denialism, when they're found out and reality comes into the picture, they look around for somebody to blame. So who do they blame? The Jews. This is bad. Okay, we're in a war, and our politicians in the West won't fight it. And we know Sweden, Germany, France, they are majorly submitting. And my own feeling is that these are countries that have a moral failure of the highest degree. Germany, we know what they did. Sweden, do you know that Sweden said they were neutral, and Sweden gave every kind of assistance to the Nazis, letting them, supplying iron and steel to them, letting their trains go across Sweden so the Nazis could jump off in Norway and kill 10,000 Norwegians? The Swedes did that, and they're preaching to us about how tolerant they are and how wonderful it is that they first decided that they were going to let in as many who wanted to come there. And the Jews of Malmo had to move. Austria is another big one, okay? Austria said they let in all the Muslims. The anti-Semitic incidents in Austria are mind-boggling. France is a country that pretended they were with the Allies. The Vichy government sent more Jews to the gas chambers than what the Nazis asked for. But by the end of the war, de Gaulle pretended he was with the Allies. Well, the Free French forces did a lot. I don't mean to minimize it. But and in the West now, in America, where the education system stresses how bad America is, and how Michelle Obama was never proud of America until her husband became president, okay, this conduces to the same kind of assuaging your guilt by welcoming the enemy. And that's what it's all about. I go on for a few chapters in the book if I've roused your interest in it. Every day I read on the internet, and every day there's something. and it's not in the CBC. You're not CBS, NBC, PBS. None of those. Those channels don't even talk about Uranium One yet. How can your Secretary of State take money into a family foundation and allow 20% of the uranium reserves, which are not just about nuclear weapons, it's about medical technology. You know, radioactive isotopes are something we all need, and Hillary sold out 20% of the supplies, and Trump is a bad guy? Okay, let me just finish up here, and because I'm anxious to hear Christine Williams talk, you know. Let me just finish up with a kind of a conclusion, and we'll pretend you heard the rest. The sooner we understand that the ideologies that lead us from tolerism to submission to the enemy, and that we can have a moral replacement to postmodernism, and the sooner we follow the Israeli example of resistance, patriotism, and social cohesion as a way to build social resilience, the sooner we can reverse our losses and start winning this war. In fact, studies show that the terrorism against Israel has been spectacularly unsuccessful with respect to breaking the resolve of the Israelis. There's all kinds of studies. And I was in Israel in 2001 to 2002, writing my book, The Second Catastrophe, and I was amazed in the height of all of the bombings. And the West pretends that what it's facing now is something that Israel didn't face. If only they'd pay attention to the way Israel handled it, everything would be different here. Anyway, I'm going to finish up. Terrorism against the West has been spectacularly successful, whether it was the Madrid rail bombings that changed the result of the Spanish elections, or 9/11, which bizarrely increased Islamophilia rather than Islamophobia. We need to show the terrorists that they'll be the losers when it comes to terrorism. How to create the social resilience necessary to strengthen our citizens for the struggle ahead is surely a difficult question. But I'm certain that unless we understand and overcome the negative ideologies, starting with tolerism, we shall have little chance of ultimate victory. Social resilience and social cohesion cannot emanate from the ideologies of denialism, inclusive diversity, cultural relativism, Trumpophobia, empathy. Empathy is a good one. Hillary made a speech, she said, we have to respect our enemies. Have you ever heard anything more ridiculous than that in your whole life? And we have to treat them with empathy. Look up the definition of empathy sometime. Okay, I don't have time to talk about it now. There can be no fair press or free press when a press is captured by one or a few ideologies and bans and boycotts competing ideologies. There can be no good education in our schools and universities without a study and appreciation of the role of ideologies in our postmodern world. The first step is reversing the Obama-era refusal to face and name the enemy, like workplace violence. The second step is understanding that this is a war, but if we stick together and develop social resilience, we can win this war. The third step is to understand what ideologies are damaging our ability to win the war. The fourth step is to differentiate, on the one hand, between the Islamists and their supporters, and on the other hand, those Muslims willing to reform their religion's compatibility with our justice system and our liberal democracy as a precondition to joining the center of our societies rather than the margins. The final step is to teach our children, after teaching the teachers, that we are the good guys, that the world has bad guys, and we cannot tolerate a descent into submission to the bad guys.
We take immense pride in our capability to manufacture the best-tasting stevia products in the world. Greenish Natural Health is the only company that offers 99.8% Reb A. Greenish's range of stevia products is an excellent zero-calorie substitute for sugar. Greenish stevia comes in sachets, rapidly dissolving tablets, and powder in jars. Ask for Greenish products at your nearest pharmacy.
I have to do this in two ways. One, of course, I have Christine's absolutely glowing professional official bio in front of me, which of course I must share with you because it is so glowing. And the second thing I'm going to do, which is totally off script, is tell you how I first met Christine Williams, and that's a very interesting story. So let me begin with introducing Christine. Christine Douglas Williams is a 9-time international award-winning broadcast journalist and television producer. Her awards include the Telly Awards, Videographer, Crystal Communications, and the Omani Awards. She is author of the book, The Challenge of Modernizing Islam, which was listed by Amazon as a #1 bestseller in the category of international institutions. Her book was published by Encounter Books in New York and commissioned by Dr. Daniel Pipes. Christine has authored hundreds of articles and blogs. Among where her writings have appeared is the Jewish Press Online, the Gatestone International Policy Institute, where she also served on the Board of Governors, Breaking Israel News, the Middle East Quarterly, USA Today Online, Wall Street Online, Front Page Magazine, the Hudson Institute, where she was a senior advisor, and Jihad Watch, a project of the David Horowitz Freedom Center. As you can see, I took a big breath before I started all this. Christine is currently public affairs and media consultant for the International Christian Embassy, Jerusalem, Canada, a former appointee to the Office of Religious Freedom as an external advisor on the Canadian Race Relations Foundation, and was on the Anti-Semitism Task Force for the Simon Wiesenthal Center for Holocaust Studies in Toronto. She is also currently on the Board of Advisors for Muslims Facing Tomorrow, for which we are extremely grateful and proud. Christine has conducted over 1,700 live television interviews in the daily call-in talk show On the Line, where she captured 6 international awards. She also served as a fill-in host for the Christian broadcast 100 Huntley Street, aired on CTS TV on the Global Television Network. So speaking about On the Line, many years ago, I was invited to come and be a guest on Christine's talk show. And when I arrived there, I found that the other guest, was a very trembling, terrified woman by the name of Wahida Valianti. Wahida Valianti was the vice president of the Canadian Islamic Congress. The Canadian Islamic Congress, infamous for its leader, Muhammad al-Masri, who said on public television that Jewish women, children, and civilians are collateral damage, and it's okay if they can be killed. So that's their claim to fame. So as I sat there, Christine Williams, in her very famous way, very directly, faced Wahida Valianti and asked her some questions and left her a trembling blob of what could I say, of nervousness, to the point where Wahida looked at me and said, "You're not going to really ask me any more questions, are you?" So that was my first introduction to Christine Williams. And, you know, if I were to say Christine is controversial, no, of course not. Seriously, it was a joy and pleasure to be on Christine's show because she never beat about the bush. Direct, frank, head-on. She always asked the right questions. She asked them directly, and I really miss that program because we don't have those conversations anymore. As Howard said, and as the rest of us will tell you, it's now all blubber, yada, 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 on CBC and CTV and everyone else, and of course, we are not invited. So I miss Christine's pithy talk shows. She did all her research. She was a wonderful anchor and a great host. It is my pleasure to call her a friend and to invite her to speak about her book. Christine Williams, thank you.
This is a spectacular group, I would say, because they not only fight for freedoms for our nation, but they're good people inside. They fight for humanity, and they're a warm group. I also want to give a shout out to a lady that I hope will never be forgotten who nurtured this group from the start, and that is Rose Lax. Now, to continue where Raheel left off, it's quite amusing because Raheel didn't see what happened after she left, because I was left a little bit by myself with Wahida Valianti. And she came up to me, pointed at me in the face, Christina, Christina, there's more to you behind that smile. And she left in a hurry. Okay, so with that being said, I'm going to start by, before I get into the book, by talking about the notion of multiculturalism, because I think that is a word that is causing a lot of difficulty that we see, not just in Canada, but globally. First of all, I like to say that the word multiculturalism can be used with a capital M, where it's enshrined in a constitution, but it could also be used with a small m, where, let's say, for the United States of America, they're dealing with a lot of different cultures within their country. The issue I take with the word multiculturalism is that it's become a whipping boy for failure. Back in 2010, 2011, you'll remember that Angela Merkel back then, as well as Sarkozy, who was the leader in France, and also David Cameron, who was a leader in the UK, they all came out and actually declared multiculturalism a failure. In fact, you'll remember that David Cameron went so far, if you were following the news back then of what was taking place, he went so far as to say multiculturalism is the reason today why we see this proliferation of terrorism that we're seeing happening. It's advanced much worse today. One thing that he did suggest back then, he said that the word shared national identity was a better word to replace for the word multiculturalism. But my issue with the word multiculturalism is that it is used too often to blame and say, the problem is multiculturalism, the problem is multiculturalism, when so many different people have a very different definition of that very word, so it ends up taking away from the real issue. And the issue is the responsibility of our leaders today. When we sing the national anthem, it encompasses standing on guard for thee in Canada. Most national anthems actually have embedded in them some form of nationalism, and the word nationalism today has become a dirty word. But when we look at the real spirit and the meaning of the word nationalism, it means I am proud of the country that I live in. I'm under a democratic constitution that actually protects human rights for everyone. Whether you're a Christian, you're a Jew, you're a Muslim, you're Buddhist, it doesn't matter what you are. It's nice to know that you could be under a flag and under a constitution that respects equal rights and human rights for all. Unfortunately, what has happened is that this word multiculturalism has, I would say, mutated into a form where people don't know what it means anymore. Some just say, well, all cultures are equal. We heard that when we were listening before I came up here to speak. Some say all cultures are equal. How could you say all cultures are equal when some cultures espouse an inferiority of women? In Hinduism, you find it. You find the same honor killings. In Islam, you find it. And in a place like China with the one-child rule, boys get the preference, where sometimes you end up forming a girl over a balcony because she just did not, she doesn't function because she's a girl and we wanted a boy. Do we call these cultures equal, that subjugate people, that hurt people, that beat down people, that do not espouse human rights? No. Human rights are supposed to be for everyone. Everyone's supposed to benefit from this word we call human rights. So for the notion of multiculturalism, first of all, we need to realize it often becomes a partisan issue where people say, oh, it's a liberal thing. Well, it was the liberal notion of Trudeau that first brought it in, Trudeau Sr., the notion of multiculturalism, but let's not forget, it was signed, sealed, and delivered by Mulroney, a conservative. Trudeau, in a dinner with the press in Ottawa, eventually somebody asked him during the dinner, was this the idea that you had in mind when you brought in multiculturalism? And this was after problems started to evolve in our country where people were starting to say, no, we're having issues here. There's some cultures coming in that don't quite espouse human rights. And Trudeau sat at that table and he actually said, no, this is not what I had in mind. So from the point of view of partisanship, yes, there are issues with partisanships, and this is what I'll get into because I'm going to be talking about M103 today, not too much, but I'll I'll deal with that at some level. But the issue is, be very careful that you're not being taken as an instrument to be confused when the word multiculturalism comes in, because people do describe different definitions. Multiculturalism in terms of a lot of different cultures under one banner of peace, of a working constitution is great, but when it's defined in terms of all cultures being equal, we run into a big problem. Canada is a diverse nation, and I'm very proud of that. This is what we're built on. Unfortunately, there's an atmosphere today where, and you see this a lot in the press, where this us versus them has come into existence. And the us versus them is usually, well, it's the Muslims against everybody else. First of all, the progressive Muslims that we see here today, Raheel and Salim, these are progressive Muslims that want to be on the same plane as everybody else. They see themselves as Canadians first. They want separation of mosque and state. They don't want special favors. They don't want to be centered out, and they're sick of what they see happening in this country. I will say what gave me the inspiration to write the book was precisely this us versus them. How do you tell the difference between an Islamist versus a true moderate? In the book, I separate moderates from genuine moderates versus crypto moderates. You've got a guy like Tariq Ramadan, who is the grandson of the Muslim Brotherhood founder Hassan al-Banna, and he calls himself moderate. But he's not a moderate. He's a Muslim Brotherhood man himself. You have genuine moderates who stand for human rights, equality for all. And this is something I'll get into more, but there's a couple other notions I'd like to address, and that is my inspiration. When I did the talk show, red flags started to go off. A lot of people asked me, including my editors, when I was in the midst of having the book published, what was it that inspired you? And I said it was more who inspired me. The three individuals that inspired me even to start this investigation was Raheel Raza, Tariq Fatah, and Farzana Hassan. They were regular individuals that I had on the show, and I started to scratch my head and say, what's going on here? Because before that, I used to have Wahida Vilianti, I used to have the Canadian Islamic Congress, and I wonder what is going on? I'm hearing a different message from both sides. I have to do more investigations here. And what really shocked me once was once when Tariq Fatah came on the show, and Raheel may have been part of that show as well, and Farzana, and started to talk about what was being preached in mosques. I couldn't believe it at first. When he talked about, and they talked about, every Friday prayer and what was coming out of mosques, the hate against Christians, the hate against Jews, the hate against democracy, and the promotion of Sharia law, I thought, what? No, this couldn't be true. But investigations have followed since. The investigative project in the States has done a lot of investigations, as much as a lot of other different organizations, and they have found that a high percentage of mosques are preaching hate. They're preaching about Jews and Christians being cursed. They're preaching values of Sharia law. And that is frightening because they're doing it in Arabic mostly. So how do we know what's being preached? And these individuals many of them, the moderates, the genuine moderates, aren't even welcome in mosques because they're not considered to be Muslims. Because they choose to modernize, to want their faith to modernize like every other. You look, for example, and you say, what about the Jews? Okay, the Jews once stoned for sins. Now, I'm not comparing different faiths because every faith, the Buddhist faith, the Christians, the Jews, every faith is very different. But you're not going to find Israel stoning people today. There's a modernization that happened. There was a time where Christians used to engage in forced conversions, and Christianity has a lot of sin. And yes, I hear, but if you look at the New Testament, you're not going to find any doctrine of that's negative, that's dark, that's violent. Well, I agree, but we also cannot ignore that we also have an Old Testament, and the fact is, a book cannot get up for itself and commit acts of violence. It's the people that practice the faith. If Muslims choose to practice their faith in peace, why aren't they being allowed to do so? On one side, I get attacked by saying, oh, Christine, you're Islamophobic, because I condemn every form of Islamic supremacism and Islamism, and there's some that still say, I don't believe in identifying Islamism from Islam because it's a violent faith. Well, here's why I differentiate it. First of all, when people ask you about Islam being a religion of peace or not, one can look historically and see that violence was committed, the caliphates did happen, a lot of violence took place. You look at Israel, Israel is fighting for its very existence today. So that is undeniable when you look historically at the violence. And yes, you look at the hadiths, you look at the sunnah, you can back it up there. You look at Islamic jurisprudence, you look, for instance, at the Sunni, and the main ones are the Shafi, the Maliki, the Hanbali, and the Hanafi. And it's sad to say, but the worst and the most violent is the Hanbali. And that is what Saudi Arabia espouses with its Wahhabism. You look at ISIS, it espouses the same thing. You start digging deeper in the news and you find the truth that Saudi Arabia has been backing ISIS on many levels. And not only that, you see that even Turkey has been doing it. You look at what's going on in Iran that's called a rogue state. No, it's not that rogue, because the Ayatollah has a lot of power. He's the supreme leader of Iran. So you start to realize Houston, we have a problem. I mean, we know we have a problem, but what is the solution? Frankly, I'm tired of everybody blaming Muslims. First of all, the Muslim Brotherhood stated very clearly in its Muslim Brotherhood plan for North America, and in the Al-Qaeda Maghreb, another document called the project was uncovered. Both documents extensively discuss, we're coming to get you, and this is how we're coming to get you. We're going to infiltrate you. We're going to get to know your government folk. We're going to get to know your media. We're going to work our way in. We're going to be like a chameleon, and we're going to infiltrate you. And it's a very extensive document, the Muslim Brotherhood document, as well as the project. So why don't we believe it? When you look at ISIS and you look at Al-Qaeda and you look at these other violent groups, they said they were going to infiltrate the refugee stream. So why are we not believing them? It's because we cannot believe them in many ways, because we don't want to believe them. Because when news is too ugly, we often say, well, let's just throw it aside and pretend it doesn't exist. But they told us they were coming for us. These Islamists, these jihadists said it, so we don't have excuses. We need to hold our leaders accountable, because look at Europe. Do we want what happened to Europe to come here? Lately, Sweden's national chief came out and said, help us, help us. And news came out that Sweden was on the verge of civil war. We look what's happening in Germany, the sex attacks all over the place. We saw what happened in the UK with these young girls, with the Muslim rape gangs. We see the 85 Sharia courts in Britain, where Muslim women are being sent back home in these courts, some of them risking getting killed. We see right here in Canada, I went for a blood test recently, a routine blood test, and the lady there was telling me, it's so sad. We got into a conversation and she said, it's so sad because sometimes I see women coming in here covered from head to toe, and their husbands are walking in front of them, they're walking behind, and they have to answer all of the health questions that we ask the lady. And then when we finally she rolls up her sleeve for the blood test, a lot of times we see bruises, we see burn marks, and we don't do anything. Well, why don't they? Nobody wants to report it. The same reason why this big cover-up with tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, and some say up to 1 million girls were assaulted by Muslim rape gangs in the UK, because people are scared. An MP, a Labour MP, Shah, her last name is Shah. I need to remember her first name there. Anyway, MP Naz Shah. She actually retweeted a message that said to those girls in the UK, shut up for the good of diversity. We are afraid as people in the West. We are afraid because we don't want to be seen as anti-diversity. Being for diversity is a very separate issue than supporting abuse. The moderate movement and the reformist movement, they want modernity. They want human rights within their religion. And some people say, it's just a few voices. Well, it's a few voices willing to speak out. And the reason why is because they end up ostracized from their own communities, they end up facing death threats in their communities, and they are ridiculed within their own communities, and even people that espouse human rights say, we don't believe them, they're not going to modernize, because if you look at their history, if you look at the schools of jurisprudence, come on. What about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights? Why are we not allowing Muslims the right to modernize if they want to live in peace with the rest of us? It is actually against the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and it becomes a persecution issue to be slamming Muslims because they're in a position where they want to say, look, we want to be your friends, we want to modernize. Instead, in the West, leaders, we find ourselves doing business with, check that list, they're called unindicted co-conspirators. There was something called the Holy Land Foundation trial. It was the largest terrorism financing trial in American history. And on that list was determined the unindicted co-conspirators to terrorism, the groups that have ties, direct ties to Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood. Most of the groups that you see today that are advising governments are these unindicted co-conspirators to terrorism who actually espouse the Muslim Brotherhood plan for North America, which is infiltration and to establish a global caliphate. And all of this is available to look up, and it's on the internet, it's everywhere. It's not something that we're just making up here, it's very easy to find. In the book, I interview Raheel. Raheel talks about coming to this country. It's a two-way street. And this is where our leaders have failed. If leaders only hold on to our Constitution, everybody will benefit. Raheel talks about in my book that she teaches her children, her and her husband, they've taught their children that it is a two-way street. But unfortunately, we've got something called the victimology complex that's taking place in the Muslim community among Islamists. Zuhdi Jasser is another interviewee in my book, and he talks about the victimology subterfuge a lot. In his words, Islamism is normative Islam and it needs tons of reform. But he talks about the victimology subterfuge and how it wins people over, where it gets people to feel we're victimizing Muslims, Muslims are victimized. Hate stats show that to this day, despite the global issues that we see going on with Islamism, that the biggest targets of hate today are the Jews and the blacks. And that still holds true. You've got Dr. Sheikh Soupy Mansoor, who I also interviewed in the book. He is the founder of the Quranist sect in Egypt. This man was once a professor at Al-Azhar University. And he was kicked out of Al-Azhar because he rejected the hadiths and he rejected the Sunnah, and he believed in the Quran, the peaceful verses of the Quran. And because he espoused peace and established the Quranist sect, he was persecuted by Mubarak and eventually exiled out of the country. When he first settled in Boston and went to mosque, he said he went to mosque to pray. He was happy to find a place to pray. Instead, what did he find? A bunch of manuals written in Arabic. And he started to go through them. And he says, oh my God, the soldiers of dictatorship have arrived in America. He saw the same Muslim Brotherhood material that he left in Egypt. It had come to America, and it's also here in Canada. You look at, Dr. Mansoor was also an interviewee in my book, and he did a wonderful job at talking about the history of Islam. And one thing he makes very clear is the Muslim right to reform. I'll tell you something that really touched me with all my interviewees in the book. The first half of the book are intense interviews with these individuals who talk about reform, or they talk about the modernization of Islam. And yes, the word reform is a little different than moderate, because not every genuine moderate looks at the notion of reform as in we go into scriptures and we change it. Leave what's in the 7th century in the 7th century. If you believe it's a misinterpretation, whatever you believe it is, but espouse the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and respect the Constitution. That is one thing all of them are unwavering on. But to come out and to allow someone to interview you about the depths of your faith and to be able to explain to people, and you know people are going to be reading this, how how you maintain your faith in the atmosphere of such questioning and such scrutiny. These people were heroes to be able to even come out and share that with the reader. And in addition to that, they give insights as to how you differentiate between a genuine moderate and reformist and an Islamist. And there is one thing that they all share, aside from the respect for democracy. All of them talk about the importance of Israel's right to exist, and they believe that that is a telltale sign. And I was told, well, that can't be true, because you have people that are not even Muslims and they don't believe in Israel's right to exist. I said, yes, but these are Muslims talking about their own faith, and this is something that they know that is part of Islamism, this hatred for the Jewish people, and this hatred for Christianity, and this hatred for freedoms. There was one man that I also interviewed, Dr. Tawfiq Ahmed with the Potomac Institute for Policy Studies. This man gets across very clearly the hatred of jihadists because he was once one himself. He once worked at the highest levels of Al-Qaeda before he came out of it. And he said, if these people can kill you with chemicals, they'll kill you. However they can possibly kill you, they will kill you. And for Israel to still be existing, it's a humiliation to jihadists. It's a very tiny nation. So how could all of these nations surrounding Israel not be able to take out Israel? It becomes a humiliation to the jihadist. To the whole jihadist identity, it becomes a humiliation. These interviews were very telling. You learn a lot from them. And then I get it from the other side. Well, maybe you should have pressed them further on their beliefs. Look, everybody has their personal faith. Everybody has to give account, no matter what religion you are. These are individuals that share their personal faith. They're individuals that have stood up in public to talk about human rights and democracy. They're the ones that faced that kind of a risk, and they still do it to this day, and they get attacked on both sides. And I had a flavor of it, because now I get attacked on both sides. I mean, I work with Muslims Facing Tomorrow. Raheel is a special friend, but I also work with counter-jihadists, and many of them are very mistrusting. And I understand that every human being, even when it comes to your children in the neighborhood, you have to ask questions. But the interesting thing is, if you want to trust people, they are open to questions. People are asking them questions all the time. And they come out and they talk about what human rights means and what they espouse. And this is something that needs to be noted. Now, I want to address M103, because this is very important to what we're dealing with today. And I'm probably over time, so I'll take 5 minutes. Okay. M103 it's a dangerous notion. I'll tell you why. First of all, as many rightly say, what's a phobia? A phobia is a medical term saying irrational fear. When you look at jihad globally, and you look at the Muslim Brotherhood, there's no irrational fear. When you look at suicide bombers, vehicles ramming into crowds, how could one person start saying you're Islamophobic just because you decide to ask questions and start to be fearful of what kind of an ideology are we dealing with here? Why are they not more open for discussion and for question and for dialogue instead of the constant victimology that Dr. Zuhdi Jasser talks about? Now, some people have asked, well, how would you feel if people were skeptical of you? I would say, well, I would just answer questions, and I would say, how could I work with you more? Because I want to be part of Canadian society, and this is what genuine moderates are actually doing. Now, a little bit about the word Islamophobia that a lot of people may not know, but many of you probably do. It's an Organization of Islamic Cooperation term that's heavily pushed. It's heavily pushed by the OIC, and they have a whole observatory on it on their website, because this has been a very fisted, aggressive push globally, because according to Islamism and the old versions, the Islamic, all of these old jurisprudence and so forth, you do not question Islam. there's an immutability in the decree. You just don't question it. That is why you have blasphemy laws in so many Islamic nations, and that's why there's apostasy. It's not supposed to be questioned. Now, if you go to the Organization of Islamic Cooperation website and you do studies on what Islamophobia is, it's a two-sided coin. And one part, it discusses anti-Muslim bigotry, which I fully agree with. There should be no bigotry. We all have to work together against bigotry, but that is a separate issue from fighting jihad. We need to work against all kinds of bigotry. So the Organization of Islamic Cooperation talks about anti-Muslim bigotry, and that's fine. But the other part is, they say that to criticize Islam is very insulting and hurtful to the Muslim person. And that goes hand in hand with what Tawfiq Hamid said about it's enraging, it's upsetting to the Muslim. So in order to do so, you're insulting the Muslim psyche, you're insulting the sensibilities, so therefore you must not criticize Islam, because when you do so, then it becomes a form of bigotry. This is the kind of notion of Islamophobia that the Organization of Islamic Cooperation is pushing. If you go through the document E411, of which M103 is built on, E411 looks like a document that came directly from the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, having almost identical wording. It's a dangerous phenomenon. We need to stand together against all forms of bigotry, yes. But to incorporate into our lives and into our constitution the term Islamophobia, first of all, it makes no sense. And next of all, it is a term to shut down criticisms of Islam, which puts Islam ahead of other faiths. And this is something that we need to be fighting. And every moderate Muslim that I've spoken to is against this M103. I have heard with my own ears where he'll go up to somebody, a politician from the Heritage Department, and say, look, you're not helping us. You're not helping progressive Muslims that want to progress, that espouse human rights, because M103 takes us back. We are here because we appreciate the Canadian Constitution. So we need to guard our constitutions and stand up for our constitutions. And while we're sitting there blaming the Muslims, we're the ones that are letting the Islamists run all over us. We're letting them do it. So we need to look hard as to who are making decisions, and as citizens, what kind of accountability are we holding people to? This is a responsibility that every one of us bears. One thing we also need to remember when it comes to, and I'll close on this note because I know there are going to be questions, is that when we support moderate Muslims, we're supporting them as part of Canadian identity. And what is Canadian identity, some say? Is it hockey? Is it cricket? Is it baseball? I heard hockey over there, but if I hear cricket over there, whatever I hear, I'm getting pointed at there. Is it potatoes and beef? Is it curry? It's all of those things, Canadian identity, but most of all, it's protection to enjoy all of our cultures under a single constitution of human rights, which must never be tampered with.
My name is Tahir Gora. I'm Secretary General of the Coalition of Progressive Canadian Muslim Organizations, as well as I represent TAG TV. The answer I'm going to pose the panelist, I do have an answer for myself. And the question is, how could we enhance our partnership to counter monster of Islamism? The answer, what I perceived, is to create parallel media. Unless and until we do not do that, unless we do not spread our message around, we won't be successful. That's my perception, and I would love to hear from you guys.
We can spend the whole evening talking about it, and my good friend Howard has been talking about it, and Christian Williamson has been talking about it. My answer is very short and simple. Vote those damn MPs out. What are you waiting for? You see, when you do not exercise your muscle, it atrophies and dies. When you lose your capacity to think, we now know what it is. It's Alzheimer. Rapidly, you become a non-entity. You are becoming non-entities in your own country because you are not exercising your responsibility. You know, what is the fundamental philosophical statement? I mean, everything else is only footnote and garbage. It begins with the statement of Socrates, know thyself. And in democracy, you have the power. And the other fundamental proposition is from the great rabbi who was put on the cross. Take the beam out of your eyes. So that's what we need. Vote these people out. The other thing I wanted to observe, look around the room. You are the fading generation. I come from the trenches. The battle has already been lost. The question is, can you save what has already been lost? The schools and the universities are lost. You know, I was a student of Alan Bloom. And I sat in his lectures, which later on became the closing of the American mind. And so that leads to my second point. I don't want to take the evening very quickly. Christine, the only difference I have with you is when you call me, I don't know about Raheel or Tahir and all the other 12 in your interview, but when you call me progressive Muslim, I'm not a progressive Muslim. I am a classical liberal or a conservative. Words have very profound meaning, and definitions have very profound meaning. I told my students today, and I was getting late coming over here, I told my students today in the question-answer period, that what sort of country are you people going to inherit? And what sort of country are you making? This week is the 100th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution that nobody in Russia wants to talk about because they lived through it. But OISE, University of Toronto, is having a 100th anniversary celebration. I'm not a progressive. They are the progressive. I am with Trump. We have to exercise our muscles.
We have a question. Donald Trump has been described as an Islamophobe because he wants to have a temporary pause to be able to understand how to vet immigrants. It's so controversial. Salim did a whole presentation to the Canadian the Senate? Immigration policy in the Senate. He said the same thing. American presidents, you would think, have never put a limitation on immigration from any country. In fact, every American president has done it, and done it big time. In my book, I mention all the times that Obama did it more than anybody. But when he suggests he wants to do it, because they don't like him, then this is something outlandish, and the Supreme Court has to get involved. Obama, Jimmy Carter, okay, one of the worst presidents in American history, he banned Iranian immigration. Are all Iranians bad? No. He said because they did some very nasty things. All right. So what's the bottom line then? The bottom line is that we have to stop immigration of people unless we can figure out a way to vet them. I can only refer you to Daniel Pipes from Middle East Forum. I quote extensively from him in my book, and I'm absolutely convinced that he has worked on a series of 93 questions. Of course, it's hard. You're talking about Islamists who have doctrines of trickery, lying for a good cause, all of these things. So I'm not naive, and believe me, Daniel Pipes is not naive.